Thanks so much, Jenny, for that great introduction. Yeah, many of you may have attended my terminal project presentation that I gave at the University of Oregon a year ago. So I've adapted that talk as I've continued to ponder the role of information technology in the field of historic preservation. I spent the summer of 2022 in Santa Fe, New Mexico for my internship after my first year at the University of Oregon. It was an incredibly gratifying experience. And one of the highlights was that I got to work with earth and plaster 5 days a week, and I didn't have to use a computer once. I assumed that the years that I had spent prior to grad school working in various tech-related jobs weren't very relevant to my future as a preservationist. I have vivid memories reading this National Geographic article from 1995, which had the article titled Information Revolution. I don't know if anyone else here recalls this very cool issue. And yeah, as someone that grew up in a household that made regular use of a rotary phone and a fax machine, it was truly hard to comprehend how to envision the vast amounts of data that would become accessible to the average person. I ended my talk a year ago with a reminder that the way we talk about data matters, and so does the way we talk about the software and tools we use to manage that data. I hope that these examples of sending Wikipedia to the moon or archiving open source software in an Arctic vault might help us think of the long view of stewarding our own historic preservation data. What will become of all of our files in a decade, a century, or 10,000 years from now? It's still a fascinating question, but I've had more pressing issues on my mind lately. I think many of us agree that the work we do as architectural historians is under threat. Here are some recent headlines from the last month or two. Materials removed from the government websites include the LGBTQ America theme study, which included a chapter on nominating LGBTQ places to the National Register. Another big topic on my mind lately is the use of artificial intelligence in our field. Here are examples of a few talks from the last year about this topic. The one organized by Pratt last October was particularly inspiring. And although the talk wasn't recorded, I'm including a list of speakers here so you can look up their work elsewhere. The keynote was given by researchers at a team called Forensic Architecture, which is based out of the University of London. They do a great job of using digital tools to help visualize their research topics. I really encourage you to check that out. As preservationists, we rely on visual representation of our data too, and accessing that data as part of our research is really important. And so although the focus of my talk will be about the National Register, it isn't the only list of historic places. There are many others, as you all know, including state historic registries or the Society of Architectural Historians, Archipedia. So the ideas I'll share during this talk will be relevant to any type of data you use as a preservationist and not just the National Register. So quick overview of my talk. I'll give a little bit of an introduction to what is open data and why it's relevant to the cultural heritage sector. I'll give a little bit of a history of the National Register in the information age. I'll give an example of how we might think of the National Register as a data set. About halfway through, we'll do some live polls using an online tool called Menti, and I'll give you more instructions about that a little later. And then I decided to pick one case study. Last year's talk had lots, but I decided to really just focus on one that I think is most relevant to the future of data and preservation, and that's going to be about linked open data. And instead of a whole bunch of recommendations, I'm going to simplify that down to just a more succinct call to action, and then hope to have plenty of time left over for some Q&A after that. So The topic of openness became quite popular in the late 2000s. In 2013, an executive order titled Making Open and Machine Readable Data, the New Default for Government Information, was framed by open data principles and policies. A recognizable outcome of this initiative is the data.gov website, which now is a central clearinghouse for thousands of data sets from agencies across federal, state, and city levels. Another example of the way open discussions around openness show up is the University of Oregon's Senate Subcommittee on Open Access, which published a white paper detailing the efforts by the university to negotiate for-profit commercial publishers of academic journals. The article 50 Shades of Open looks at the linguistic history of the word open, which generally meant access to a shared resource, and connects this meaning to current political, legal, technical, and cultural impacts. The book on the right, titled Open Data and the Knowledge Society, was published in 2017 and is based on the work funded by the European Commission and looks at four main, quote, grand challenges of open data. And these include stakeholder values and interrelationships, technological barriers, legal and ethical issues, and institutional and policy issues. It's a really good overview of kind of the big boom of open data that happened kind of around the middle of last decade, so about 10 years ago. All of those grand challenges I mentioned are relevant to data management and historic preservation as well. So we have a lot to learn about the ways openness has already been explored in other fields, including, for example, archaeology. Another common term used to describe data is FAIR, which stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. It's worth clarifying that FAIR and open data are not synonymous. The diagram on the left kind of helps illustrate that it defines open data as freely used, modified, and shared by anyone for any purpose, whereas data which is fair can have clear and transparent conditions that limit its access when necessary. The doctoral thesis titled U.S. Department of the Interior Sharing Fair Data Fairly by Jason Earl Duke in 2022 brings discussion of open and fair into a setting historic preservation practitioners can likely identify with. Earl explores the wide adoption of FAIR principles in scientific fields, but notes that after an extensive literature review, quote, no papers were located that guided federal government agencies on the proper application of the FAIR principles or how to make data and metadata more fair. So although FAIR has been widely adopted and debated within cultural, resource, and science fields, there's still a need for more clarity within federal government and specifically preservation settings. The article titled Centering Relationality, a Conceptual Model to Advance Indigenous Knowledge Organization Practices, written by Sandra Littletree, Miranda Ballard-Lewis, and Marissa Elena Duarte in 2020, offers an overview of the differences in Euro-American and Indigenous knowledge organization practices. An Indigenous system of knowledge centers relationality and holism, as outlined in this diagram from their paper. The authors, who are members of Indigenous communities and also information science scholars, discuss the way these differences require them to code switch while navigating two different systems and two different philosophies at their core. I felt it was important to highlight this article, given that a list such as the National Register or many other state or other inventory lists let's see, is an example of a knowledge organization with roots in Euro-American knowledge organization. The National Register includes expressions of indigenous systems of knowledge, such as buildings or art. Their article is a reminder of a need for us to take into account our identities within systems of power and oppression, especially as we create data management systems. The authors note that, quote, the progressive American ideology that requires that public libraries and state archives provide public access to all information, end quote, can run counter to the sovereignties of native nations. As such, this is a reminder that openness, when defined or implemented as a public access to all information, can have detrimental consequences and shouldn't always be seen as a beneficial or the only approach for all data management solutions. During my research, I came across articles, books, and journals about open data and historic preservation, but I found that very little was written about the intersection of open data and the National Register. Guidance from governmental organizations, such as this document titled from the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, titled Digital Information Task Force, or the page about digitizing the National Register, they don't make explicit references to the term open data, despite this being a very kind of popular term in allied fields. So part of my research motivation was to understand why this was the case, or at the very least, try to understand if preservations would be more open to adopting more explicit and intentional use of open data ideas and tools. And as Jenny mentioned in the introduction, those other allied fields often labeled as GLAM, or galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. Before looking at contemporary discussions of open data and why they are relevant to the National Register, let's go back in time to 1969. The National Preservation Act had been passed just 3 years earlier. We're looking at a chart of listings of the National Register on a yearly basis starting in 1966. It's my understanding that all National Historic Sites were automatically granted National Register status without a formal nomination and process. So that's why there's a kind of a big chunk in 1966, but very few in 67 or 68. So it took a few years for the new nominations to kind of start being added to the National Register. The data management implications of tracking information about buildings all around the country were in the forefront of the plans at the beginning of the National Register. The report titled An Information System for the National Register was prepared in a joint effort by the National Park Service and IBM. The IBM report detailed the plans for storage of computerized nomination records and of the way the boundaries of historic districts with complex geometric shapes would be simplified and simplified as rectangles in the system so as to enable geographic and spatial analysis. Although many of the data analysis possibilities of the proposed IBM system took decades to fully realize, the most tangible result of this report is the actual paperwork for the nomination forms, which remained relatively unaltered for some time. In 1974, just 5 years after the IBM report, a graduate student was granted access to all the raw data in the system at the time. And he explored many different data analysis exercises to better understand the data and the issues with the way it was being collected and stored. As far as I know, this is the earliest written account of someone using a software package to tabulate and analyze real-world National Register data. And it's kind of like if pivot tables existed in 1974. In 1978, the National Park Service launched a newsletter titled CRM Bulletin, which was intended to help National Park Service staff and other cultural resource professionals to keep up with changing philosophy, techniques, and technology in the preservation field. Newsletters include examples of uses of software for visualizing data. And my favorite is, of course, is the charming clip art from that era. The newsletter also solicited information from readers about novel uses of computers. In 1984, 2 helpful articles were featured in the Association for Preservation Technologies Bulletin. These were titled The Computerization of Historic Preservation by Barbara Wyatt and The National Register Computerization by Bruce McDougall. Wyatt opens with the assertion that, quote, the Preservation Office that does not seriously consider computerizing is avoiding one of the most exciting aspects of historic preservation. Wyatt explores in depth the three main challenges for the preservation community. One, lack of computer literacy and guidance from within the field. Two, too little commitment to funding computerization. And three, lack of standardized data dictionary across different databases. McDougall looks at how the various data categories built into the National Register database would make it possible to, quote, ask the system to provide answers to a wide variety of research questions related to historic properties. So even in the earliest stages of digitization, the National Register database was described as a research tool and not just a repository of data. This characterization of the National Register as a knowledge base to be queried and asked questions of is central to how I've been framing my own research on the topic. The CRM Bulletin newsletter also featured in-depth articles about plans for future innovations of the National Register Information System. These newsletters also recognized the fact that preservation data was spread out across many different databases. And I really like this diagram on the right, which shows a single building from the Hampton Historic District and how it appeared in various records accessible at the time. Taking a step out of just the preservation practice, in 1988, there was an edition of the Whole Earth catalog called Signal, which focused specifically on technology and access to information. It was published shortly before the World Wide Web was born and helped the public navigate the new emerging digital world. The catalog included guides on how to purchase computers and use word processing and database software. A lot has changed in 35 years since it was published. And although the word open data gained widespread use only much more recently, the lens of this catalog, and indeed the lens of the CRM Bulletin, certainly feel like an early nod to the principles of openness. The takeaway here is that even in the early days of personal computers, the public had an interest in acquiring digital research skills and tools, and an interest in accessing government publications and data sets in electronic formats. 1991 is the earliest example I can find about National Register data being packaged and formatted for public consumption, specifically for public consumption. One could access the catalog of National Register listings on a CD for the price of $295. Diane Miller's article in the CRM Bulletin of titled 23 Years of Automating the National Register offers a much more complete timeline of computerization efforts. As the title suggests, automation was, and as we showed earlier with the IBM report, automation was part of the earliest considerations when the National Register first came into being in the late 1960s. Miller describes the many budgetary, administrative, and technical issues faced by efforts to establish a comprehensive database, which meant that it, quote, it took until 1986 to complete automation of all National Register listings. Miller notes that, quote, we are still striving to meet some of the requirements outlined in 1969. And I found it really interesting that she writes, future directions for the National Register Information System will focus on developing a more open computer architecture, incorporating technological advances, continuing to disseminate National Register information. So I'm kind of curious what Diane Miller meant with the word open, why she decided to quotation marks around it. Anyone knows how to get in touch with Diane? I'd love to sit down for coffee with her. But, as the year 2000 approached, other publications, such as the newsletter from the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training, highlighted the ways that the internet and websites were being used to make information available to the public. And in the article, the regular column Computer Forum and the APT Bulletin from 1997, there's this really interesting quote and I'll read it here. Part of the problem is that we are whelmed both over and under by the internet, overwhelmed by the marketing hype, the novelty, the infatuation with high tech, and the ultimate challenge of discovering how to use the web constructively in our jobs. Underwhelmed by the seemingly low percentage of websites that are well organized, maintained regularly, and contain useful, accessible information. And I think these words kind of still ring true to this day. What I've been trying to communicate with the last few slides is the vision for the National Register has always included an interpretive and storytelling component. And my question for you all of you is how can we incorporate contemporary digital research tools as we do our work as architectural historians? The National Register has been assessed through a critical lens, both within the National Park Service, such as in this preservation by the Keeper of the National Register at a conference in 2021, or this recent report by Latinos in Heritage Conservation. The focus of my research during the last couple of years has been to consider how an open data framework might help address this need for better data about the National Register, not just for the sake of better data, but as a way to improve our ability to critically assess the National Register and as a way to maintain its importance and relevance in the field of preservation. Here are just a few questions posted by members of the Historic Preservation Professionals Facebook page. And it's just a small sampling of the type of research questions being posed about the National Register. So kind of as an experiment and trying to wrap my mind around the depth and breadth of the National Register, I did a little data analysis experiment that I'd like to go over here. Many of you may be familiar with the spreadsheets available on the National Park Service website. So what I did is I downloaded that spreadsheet, and every National Register listing has a link to a page on the National Archives website. So what I did is I automated and I looked up the direct PDF download for each of those files, and then I let a script run for a few days and actually downloaded 76,000 PDFs just so I could kind of get a sense of what was being stored there and kind of the type of information available. I'll get back to what I found about the statistics in a second, but while I was poking around the PDFs, I came across this one. Well, first of all, I should mention that most of the records on the National Archive website don't just include the National Register listing themselves, but they also include all the supplemental material that was compiled during the review process. So all the letters in favor, the letters against, and I think this is just like a really rich record that we could be using more as researchers. And the cool part I want to highlight about the Wainwright building is that it was threatened to be demolished in the 60s, and John D. Randall wrote this pamphlet arguing for its preservation, and he wrote an open letter to the President Johnson. It was signed by all these famous architects who talked about why they didn't want to see the building be demolished. But this all happened right at the beginnings of the national preservation movement, and so it's a really great time capsule of the way preservation was being argued for. So I really encourage you all to check this out. It's a really great document, and the reason I bring it up is because recently, last year, the state of the building is owned by the state, and it was being sold to a private buyer last year. So there was questions about the future. Would the buyer demolish it? Would the buyer renovate it? What would happen to it? And amidst all the articles, I didn't see any mention of this little pamphlet. And I think digging back into our archives can help us. I guess what I'm trying to say is if I were to advocate for the preservation of the Wainwright building, I would very much want to reference this excellent piece from 1960s. And it's really just difficult to find. If you do Google search for the title on Google, you won't find any download of it. So it's just kind of buried in this rich repository on the National Archive website. So I'm going to close this tab because it's a huge file and it's slowing my computer down, but I encourage you all to look at it. So back to the statistics. So what I did is for each of the PDFs I downloaded, I counted the pages and the megabytes, and that way we can sort the data by page count. So if I go largest to smallest, you can see that there's some really huge files, over 1,000 pages. Some of the files themselves are almost 4 gigabytes large. But for the most part, most files, the page count is 11 to like 40 pages. So just want to end with not end, just summarize with some quick statistics of what I learned about the 76,000 files. Is it's a total of about 4 terabytes of data, just over 3 million pages. And of course, that includes double-sided pages, and an average of 50 megabytes per file and 41 pages per file. So this is just kind of an example of the data analysis possibilities of the National Register. So I'd like to take a chance to hear from you all now. So what we're going to do is I'd like to ask you to open a browser either on your computer or on your mobile device and go to menti.com. And there's a code that it will ask you to put in, and we're going to run through a few polls and interactive kind of questions for y'all. So I'll wait for a minute for y'all to join. If you have any questions about accessing the page or have issues, please let me know. I see Jay has added the website and the code in the comments. So thanks for that. Can I get a thumbs up if you're able to see the poll on your end? Awesome, great. Okay, so go ahead and start filling in. I think you should see an option for like 3 or 4 words. I'd like you to just write a couple words about your feelings to open data. It could be things like curiosity, uncertainty. Yeah, let's see if you start adding them, they should appear on the screen in live. So oh, there we go. Awesome. Thanks for all your contributions. I'll let this run for another minute here. Glorious. I love that. Vulnerable. Yeah, so I think we see a wide range of kind of answers here. So maybe during the Q&A session, if you want to share more about why you wrote specific words, I'd love to hear more. But for now, we'll just keep it to this word cloud. Okay, well, I will give it 30 more seconds, and then we'll move on to the next question. All right. So the next slide is what digital research tools have you used in the past year? Could be anything from specific software, could be anything from specific websites or archives. The goal here is that you might have used a tool that someone else might not have thought about, and that they might find worthy of incorporating into their toolkit. So. Ooh, Python. I'm curious about who's using Python and for what. Perhaps we can hear more about that at the end of the talk. Great. These are all awesome tools. So, all right. I'm going to move on to the next slide or the next poll. So considering how big National Register data set is and the types of information it holds, I'm wondering what kind of questions you want to ask about the National Register. It could be how to find a specific or about a specific topic, or as kind of an aggregate of all the National Register nominations. So, and the goal here is that you might have a question that you've not been able to answer, but that someone else in the audience might know a way of answering. So. All right. These are all great questions, and I hope that during the Q&A section, we can open up the floor and try to answer some of these. So. All right, so you can set the Menti aside. I'm going to continue for a few more slides here. So I'd like to briefly introduce linked open data. Linked open data is a commonly used way of storing data. A really popular illustration you'll see pop up a lot when the topic is discussed is like the header on the website on the right. The main idea is that when data is described in a way a computer can understand, the overlapping connections between data sets, we can explore data in different ways. So I'd like to highlight a few examples of linked data projects that I think you will all appreciate. One example of a linked data project is run by the Semantic Lab at Pratt. And the Semantic Lab at Pratt is a collective of researchers, students, and practitioners exploring new forms and functions of semantic technologies for libraries, archives, and museums. The main outcome of the linked jazz project was to take several different databases that track jazz history and create linked open data models that would allow users to query and analyze data across these different databases. So why is this relevant to the National Register? Well, for one, it's a novel data management approach that preservationists will eventually encounter. The project highlights the best practices in data management that were learned from the process of cultural organizations coming together with academics to test a new technology. It suggests that the data within the National Register could become more powerful when linked up with other databases. And I think most importantly, the Linked Jazz project documents the process, not just the outcome, and illustrates the way the relationships between the people, places, and events surrounding a cultural movement are able to be documented and analyzed. I think this type of analysis is similar to the analysis done during the research undertaken by a National Register nomination preparer. So imagine that similar linked open data projects may eventually be incorporated into the research for National Register nominations. There's a great conference called the Linked Data LD4 conference, and the Linked Jazz project was featured in that conference, I believe, last year. LD4 is a group of cultural resource professionals who share their experiences about using linked data in their work, and I'll just give you a quick tour of their website. You can find more information about specifically within the LD4 community. There's affinity groups that work on different focus areas, and the art and design affinity group is the one I found to be most related to historic preservation, because they talk a lot about cataloging art, architecture, and they hold monthly meetings. They're called affinity groups, and each month there's a different speaker talking about their linked data projects. You can access the notes from past talks, and I hope you can join future calls. And I'd like to bring to your attention the 2025 Linked Data Conference is happening later in July. The call for papers hasn't been opened yet, but I do hope that someone out there in preservation is working with linked data would maybe consider presenting at this conference. Another one of the presentations from the Linked Data Conference was about LGBTQ archives at the University of Las Vegas, and they just talked about how they used source material and turned it into linked data for various research projects that they're working on. Another reason I really appreciate the LD4 community is that the conferences involve a lot of participatory learning and sharing, kind of like we did earlier today, earlier in the talk with the Menti. And this is just an example of one of the talks about Wikidata that folks were giving feedback on to the presenter. So, while I haven't observed much use of linked data amongst preservation professionals or government agencies in the preservation field, I want to highlight the way the National Register appears on Wikipedia as a way to pique your interest and hint at how the use of linked open data could become more widespread amongst the preservation community. So you're all probably very familiar with the Wikipedia and possibly articles about National Register listings. But it's worth remembering that the Wikipedia platform offers a lot of features that help us understand how that data came to be. So one of the things I like to do is see how a topic, especially if it's a preservation topic, has developed over time. So I found it interesting that you can go to the view history and then go to the oldest version of the National Preservation article, and you can see the first version of this was from 2002 and was just a single paragraph. And so what I found is that every single National Register listing has a corresponding article on Wikipedia. And that is thanks to the volunteers who tabulate all the data in so that it's presentable on Wikipedia. The efforts to organize all that data is centralized in a wiki project titled National Historic Register of Historic Places. And what it does is it gives volunteer editors all the resources they need to make sure that Wikipedia articles are complete and accurate and reflect the up-to-date information about National Register listings. One of the ways they've done that is through the use of an info box. And what that is just like a blank template that takes in data from a linked data database and standardizes the way information is presented for each of those National Register listings. So for example, they give the example of the Manzanar War Relocation Center. So this is the info box that appears in the actual article. And it includes basic statistics like location, the year it was built, year was added to the National Register. But interestingly, it also includes, in some cases, dates and data about other heritage listings, such as the California, and I believe also the LA historic listing for that as well, even though it's not in LA, but it's made the list at least. Part of what having all this data stored in a central place allows the Wikipedia editors to do is keep track of the types and quality of the articles about each National Register listing. And so what they've done is they've come up with their own rating system and rated the quality of the articles themselves so that they can try to improve so that every single National Register listing article meets a better kind of criteria. It's their own criteria that they've come up with. So I'd like to take a look at an actual specific article about a National Register listing. And I picked one that many of you all are familiar and one that I learned about in my time at University of Oregon. It's the Dean's Beauty Salon and Barbershop. So here we see this kind of standardized template that's, and what I'm trying to, I want to stress here is that this data isn't just manually entered on this page. It's kind of like living off in its own Wikidata database. So we can kind of take a look at the behind the scenes of that database, and we can see that the Wikidata record stores all of these different tidbits of data separately and uniquely. So there's a picture, there is, once again, location, but then most importantly, kind of the data about the National Register listing itself, when it was listed, the criterion, and whether it was a part of a multi-property submission. And the thing about Wikidata is that editors are encouraged to add a reference anytime there's like a record. And so oftentimes they'll link to the actual nominations themselves or the weekly list that the National Park Service puts out. So I think something important to note is that Wikidata doesn't just store the record of building, it also understands that the nomination form that led to the listing of that building is kind of its separate own record. So we can go here and look through this and see that it has a separate field for the title, but then most interestingly, it has the names of the authors. In full disclosure, I don't know the person who's been behind adding authors, but I think it could be an example of a way to bring more kind of ease of use when it comes to authors' names on register nomination forms, because it's currently buried in the PDF and there's no way for me to say, find all National Register nominations written by a specific person. And if not only does it link to the it also includes a link to the actual PDF download itself. So I'll show you an example of a little more complex one, which is the Astoria Downtown District. It lists the corresponding buildings within that district, and you could click on any of these and find kind of more information about those. So now I chose to look at the Wainwright building, just an example of a building that's more well-known at a national level, just to see the other types of heritage listings that link back to it. And those are usually listed at the end. So we have the Encyclopedia Britannica ID, we have an Atlas Obscura ID, but interestingly, we don't have a Society of Architectural Historians ID. And as far as I know, those values are not stored in Wikidata, so there's not really an easy way to say, for example, how many National Register buildings are also in Archipedia, or vice versa. However, there is an SH Archipedia article about it. There's no easy way to know that overlap. So, all right. Wikidata offers an online tool to pull and query all that data. I won't go into how to do that now. It's a way more complicated process, but I just want to highlight the questions at the beginning of the tutorial. And it asks, have you ever wondered about questions like these? What are the largest cities in the world that have a female mayor? What airports are located within 100 kilometers of Berlin? Who were all known descendants of Genghis Khan? So the tutorial goes on and helps you write queries that help you answer these exact questions. And I want to show you those just to kind of get your minds running as to like what kind of questions might you be able to ask of the National Register. So I've started to do a really cursory look at the data about the National Register in Wikidata, and I've kind of created a website where I'm keeping track of my own research. And I'll share this in the chat here. You can follow along later if you'd like. But what I've done is I've created a few kind of canned queries just to look at, for example, I'm not going to go through how to write a query right now. I'm just going to look at the results. And so this query asks Wikidata, tell me every single National Register listing and tell me the date that's in reference to its listing date. So yes, some of this information is accessible in the Excel file I showed you earlier, but it's not necessarily accessible as a queryable database. And being able to write really complicated queries that also talk to other databases is kind of part of the power of a Wikidata query. So as I mentioned, this one just simply gets the name of the property and the date. One that's a little more complicated is it's looking for all of the National Register listings that also have an author name associated, such as the one for the Dean's Barbershop. And I thought it was cool that our namesake of our chapter, who wrote the nomination form for the First Methodist Episcopal Church of Salem, is listed here as one of the authors, alongside, of course, not surprisingly, Elizabeth Walton Potter, who many of you know. So yeah, and if I were to do a more thorough job of this record, I would maybe add a reference and just like actually put a link to the PDF if it's not already here. So, but the PDFs are listed down here. So, and lastly, in terms of Wikidata queries, I prepared one that lets you put in a whole bunch of different National Register related topics or ideas or things, and it just tells the query to find all the ways these things are connected. So I threw a bunch of preservation related topics in there, and let's see if there's a way to look at this full screen. Let's see. So I can't get the full screen view on that, but basically I said find all the connections between the National Landmark, the National Register of Historic Places, and then I added the Wainwright Building and the Astoria Downtown District just to see all the types of links. So you can imagine the infinite possibilities and ways to illustrate all the ways that National Register data is interlinked and the way the metadata works with each other. So let's see here. So back in 1990, there was an article in it was a big report compiled. It was titled "Computer Use in State Historic Preservation Offices." As far as I know, it was the only time this data was calculated. And what it did is it sent out a survey to each state historic preservation office and asked them really detailed questions about what databases they're using, what software they were using, what type of data capabilities they had. And at the end of that report, the authors kind of like imagined what a super system would look like, a system that would like do everything and keep track of all the data that a preservationist would ever want to know. Because of the way, state preservation offices work independently, I don't think that big super system was ever really a feasible thing, but in retrospect, a lot of those connections are already happening in Wikidata. And so part of what I'm excited about is learning more about how to use Wikidata to kind of answer better questions about National Register and about preservation. So, and finally, call to action is to consider the ways we can facilitate innovation amongst our community of preservation professionals. There's a really excellent book called Open a GLAM Lab, and it was sponsored by a bunch of universities and institutions around the world, including the Library of Congress. And they wrote this really great guide about how to organize a lab. And they kind of defined the word lab as pretty broadly. But I'd like to just highlight the one couple of examples that they show here. And that included the lab set up at the Library of Congress. And I think you'll find a lot of the projects that they worked on are really relevant to historic preservationists, and kind of hope that we might continue to lead projects like these. The Seeing a Lost Enclaves project by Jeffrey U. Warren is a really cool project where he took archival materials from Sanborn's maps and newspapers and worked on creating 3D models of what historic neighborhoods might have looked like. Another example this book highlights is the Library of Scotland and the way that they offer their data kind of in an automated fashion. And lastly, the book also highlights the work of individual people, one of whose named is, can't remember his name, but he has this whole toolkit on using data, and I'm really inspired by the work he does. Once again, he's talking about what you can do with GLAM data, how to learn about coding, and making use of a lot of different public data repositories. So I really encourage you to check this out. And he's based out of Australia, but I'm hoping that his work can inspire us to do similar work here in the US. And the one last thing that that book makes reference to is a document called 50 Things You Can Do. And I would encourage us all to think about the small steps we can take either at our own preservation jobs at state historic preservation offices or architecture firms, and thinking about data as a valuable resource that's cool and worth showing off. So I found this post by the data.gov website on social media that had a screenshot of something like a spreadsheet or a data file, and it made me question whether preservationists should be showing off our data more and encouraging innovative and kind of creative thinking about it. So in conclusion, the work we all do around the National Register remains so important. A lot of what we see in the National Register memorializes really difficult history. Two examples of these on the screen, but I'm encouraged to see the ways that it also highlights really positive stories that are, quote, associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. So in closing, my encouragement to you is that we can continue to research and highlight stories of, among other things, queer joy and Black community organizing. So I have one last Menti question that we can just kind of have in the background as we open it up for questions. And let's see if I can pull that up here. So, great. So I'm open to questions. I'm open to opening up the floor to a discussion. And in the meantime, you can feel free to add National Register listings that you find particularly inspiring these days and that you would love for your colleagues to also know about. So thank you all.
Thanks so much, Matt. That was really enjoyable. Hope you guys will take an opportunity to drop some questions in the chat. It looks like one already came in from Amanda. Thanks for showing how Wikidata does, or rather doesn't, connect with SAH Archipedia, but does the Wikidata interface with Getty at all, which is where SAH Archipedia is pulling metadata. Can you speak at all to that?
I don't know off the top of my head it does, and I should mention that Wikidata is just one of many repositories of data. Sometimes institutions decide to use the Wikipedia platform to store their data. Other times they create their own more controlled versions of those. And so there's just like an endless world of data sets out there that I've only barely started to get familiar with. And I know Getty is one of them. They have a kind of a standardized vocabulary of architecture names. And that's a great question. And I'd love to find out the answer for you and get back to you on that. So.
I have a quick question while we're waiting for some others to come in. I'm excited about the possibility of peeking at the Wikidata queries, but I was wondering if during any of your research you found other successful tools to try and cross-search across nominations, perhaps even other SHPO offices that were employing platforms that were more easily accessible, perhaps than the few that I'm familiar with here on the West Coast.
So I wish I could say I've tried all 50 states portals out. I know that many states don't have online portals, and that that inventory mentioned from 1990 suggested that the inventory should be done once a year. So a project I'm thinking could be useful is to do a really thorough kind of assessment of every state's portal and say, kind of maybe give it a scorecard, how easy it is to use. Does it meet standard website accessibility guidelines? And I think one thing I'd like to try to highlight is that if there's a state that's doing something really good and really useful, that they should make their software really reusable by other states so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel 50 times and pay 50 different contractors to write 50 different sets of software, and that somehow that there might just be kind of like a standardized open source software that SHPOs can implement. Now, that's a really, really difficult kind of task. So in the meantime, we might not all be using the same software tools, but at the very least, we can all be using the same kind of common data standards, so that if all SHPOs shared their public data as linked open data, I could go and kind of create a query and says, I think maybe a simple example is like, if I were to say, how many Frank Lloyd Wright buildings are listed on the National Register, and in what states are they? I don't really know of an easy way to answer that question now. I think I could probably write a Wikidata query to do that. But I'm still very new to Wikidata queries, and so yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Let's see. I'm going to try to look through some of the questions here in the chat. Elsa writes, there is really amazing. I can imagine this would be scaled down for local registers or up to thinking about World Heritage listings as well. Have I tried querying around building site typologies and styles? I have not, but if it's a field that's stored in Wikidata, it's queryable. Whether or not there's a volunteer effort to ensure that like building sites and typologies are added to every single building in Wikipedia or not. And then there's of course the question of like, whose list of building styles and typologies are you using? And that's kind of why I find the linked data conferences really, really cool, is because other fields are grappling with questions about how do you standardize the way categories work in your field. And how do you work around the fact that there's so many ways to describe the same things? And so yeah, it'd be really cool to have better kind of standardized definitions, but also realizing that building styles are so tricky to talk about. But
It looks like you got a request to show us how to query on Wikidata. It's it sort of an intimidating or layered process, Matt?
let me see what I can do here. It's not something I'm comfortable doing live, but I can at least pull up the query that I ran and try to kind of illustrate it a little more. Let's see.
And it sounded like earlier you had a how-to page up. So Wikidata does have a how-to page where you could walk through those steps. Is that correct?
Yes.
For the Brave?
Yeah, so I think the one in question is, let's see. Can you show us briefly how to use the Wikidata query you created that generates and illustrates networks? So I included that in the kind of just the set of samples here. What you need to know is that every preservation kind of topic or concept or place has what's known as a Q number. And so let's see, let's look for a building, Empire State Building. And I will find its Q value. So Q9188. And then we'll just take a quick look through to see Empire State Building's really popular building. So it's going to have tons of data that's been added to it. But because it's a National Register building, we assume that, or I assume it is. Anyway, so I'll go back to my query, and the reason that I need to add it as a thing to add to the network twice is because I want the network to look at the relationships going both ways, not just one way or the other. So I'm going to just sneak this in here. Oh, and so, and I'm keeping the Astoria one in there just because I don't think there will be any connections between Astoria and the Empire State Building. You never know. So I'm going to rerun the query and let's see what happens here. I still have not figured out how to get a better, oh, here we go. So Empire State Building is added to that network. We can see that it has a heritage designation of the National Register. It's also a historic national landmark, national historic landmark. And I could put in a bunch of these other things about the national or the Empire State Building and start to kind of build this network and visualize it more. So the query service itself has let's see, there's like a somewhere there's like a visual builder for the query, but what I found that it doesn't really deal with preservation data very well. So you can use this to get familiar with it, but I found that a lot of the more complicated ones you have to kind of build from scratch. So okay, Michael Hauser says, my eyes are open. Just who are those mice behind the curtain whom are pulling the wiki data and how often is it getting updated? I'm not sure what you mean by that. Do you mean who are the volunteers making sure Wikidata is up to date? And I guess the answer to that would be that project page I showed earlier. Let's see if I can pull it up. Somewhere. So there's a list of hundreds of contributors to the wiki efforts to document the National Register, hundreds literally. Something that I skipped over is that on this project page is a little talk page, and it has 70 pages worth of discussions. So if you want to know how hundreds of volunteers have organized together to make National Register information available on Wikipedia, you can look through decades worth of that and all the planning that goes into it, all the data cleanup and discussions. There's even an index, and what I found is that if you go to the index and go to sort by replies, you can find kind of the hottest topics, and those are oftentimes kind of where the juicy debates. There's some really contentious discussion around how data works on Wikipedia. And so you can really get a sense of kind of the dialogue that goes into getting all this all on Wikipedia. So, and what I'm trying to emphasize is not that I think that Wikipedia needs to replace the National Register or something like that, but I want to stress the participatory nature of data curation in Wikipedia and how it's really helpful to me to see how data solutions are achieved on Wikipedia. And I think what I wish is that more SHPOs and the National Park Service would make that process more clear. I think those early National Park Service bulletins from the 80s really did a great job of showing the process and showing the debates. And I'd really like more of that now. I'd really like to see people who are in charge of historic resource inventories give talks at conferences, like how did we build our database? Here are the challenges, here are the solutions, just so that we could all learn from each other a lot more. So. So we're getting near the end of our time. Happy to take any more last minute questions. Oh, let's go back to the Menti and see. We have a few inspiring National Register Historic Places listings. So I hope you all get a chance to check these out. And yeah, we'll keep this up here for a moment.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. Oh,
Yeah.
go ahead, Jay. Perfect.
I was just going to say there's a last question in the chat from Josh about the best state level preservation data portals on the West Coast. And I'm not sure if Josh, you're asking for like which state does it best, or kind of which software is easiest to use. But I wonder if you had a thought about that question, Matt, about various state databases you've looked at.
I mean, I'm just familiar with the Oregon and Washington state databases, mostly because of my time as a student researching those. I don't think there's a lot of other like alternate or options or other possibilities. Maybe there are, I'm just not familiar with them. Obviously, Archipedia is nationwide. But thanks, Chris and Larissa, for your comment. And for everyone else who's attended. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for coming out. And thank you so much, Matt, for your willingness to share this research. It's been really interesting. Yeah, we're excited and excited so many new folks are plugging into MDR and learning a little bit more about the breadth of the work that we do, and excited that hopefully we'll see some of you guys in October.
Yeah.
We'll cut you loose as we're out of time, but thank you again, everybody, for showing up today. It's been really great. Appreciate it so much.
Thanks all. Have a lovely
Thanks,
weekend.
everyone.